By December 1950, two things had happened. Firstly, winter had arrived and we hadn't really been ready for it, and it was a terribly bitter winter, as every Korean winter proved to be from then on. And secondly, the Chinese had come into the war on North Korea's side. We were in the waters right up a river at Chenampo, which is the port for Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. We were very cold. We'd been in pancake ice outside in the Yellow Sea before we went upriver. It was so cold. Ice actually on the sea that we were pushing our way through. Our superstructure was covered with icicles and everything had ice, all the guardrails. And we were up there trying to cover the evacuation ahead of the Chinese advance of a lot of our friendly troops. We were at action stations. We were there all day waiting. The boys began to get a bit nervous and fidgety. You do when you can hear the Chinese advancing over the nearby hills and the guns and see the smoke going up. My captain suddenly turned to me and said, "First Lieutenant, paint superstructure." I said, "Sir?" And then I realised that I shouldn't be questioning him, and I said, "Aye, aye, sir," and I realised what he was up to. He knew that idle minds made worried minds, and that idle hands were best occupied with something. So I said, "Right, one man from every gun's crew, go down below to the paint shop, get a pot of paint, bring it up. Hands paint gun mountings and superstructure, but make quite sure that you don't leave your action stations. Use rags to wash off or to wipe off as much of the ice and snow as you can, and then put the paint on." So by the time we carried out our final duties that night of bombarding the shore after all the troops had come out, the ship was looking like a new pin. It was probably the most handsome looking ship in the whole of the Korean waters. And off we sailed after the operation was successfully carried out, downriver again, and down to Incheon, which was the port for the South Korean capital, where we were expecting much the same thing to happen a couple of weeks later. In fact, on Christmas Day, we were anchored off Incheon. I was on the bridge. The captain was down below enjoying Christmas dinner with the troops. And the weather had improved a little. The temperature had gone from -20, which it had been at for some weeks by then, up to 0. And as I looked, I suddenly, to my horror, saw that all the lovely paint that I'd put on the guns and superstructure 2 weeks earlier was falling off in bedraggled strips. And I couldn't work out what was happening until suddenly it occurred to me, of course, the temperature had risen. We had painted, without knowing it, over a thin layer of nice, dry, cold ice, and that ice was now melting, and all the paint was dripping off. By the end of that little episode, we were looking the ugliest and untidiest ship in all Korean waters.
Okay, good.
Off Chenampo, while we were waiting for the army to evacuate themselves down the river, we took our sailors' minds off the worries of the moment as the Chinese approached by getting up some pots of paint and getting them to paint the gun mountings and superstructure in the vicinity of their action stations. We finished up looking very nice as a result, probably one of the nicest looking ships on the coast. And 2 weeks later, we were down off Incheon. Much the same operation was probably expected. I was on the bridge, the captain was down below enjoying Christmas dinner with the troops, and I suddenly saw with horror that all the paint I'd put on a couple of weeks earlier was falling off. And I worked out all too late that, in fact, when we'd put the paint on, the temperature had been -20 degrees. There'd been a thin layer of ice all over the whole ship, and the paint had been put on over that thin layer of ice. The temperature had now risen on Christmas Day to 0 degrees. The ice had melted and all the paint fell off in sheets. That was the unfortunate result of not really understanding the conditions of a bitter Korean winter.
Good, excellent. Excellent, thank you. All right, and let's just go on. We'll just keep rolling. And just talk to me about your impressions of the climate and just in a very general sense.
Our ships, of course, had been built for the tropics. All our war, World War II, nearly, certainly the Australian Navy had been in the tropics. Some of the British Navy had cold weather, I'd experienced that, but our ships were not designed for cold weather. When the Korean winter hit us, much, much colder than anything we'd ever met, we were quite unprepared for it. We were still almost in tropical clothing. We found enough to keep warm sometimes below decks. On deck we didn't have anything really warm enough. In the mess decks I looked hard. I, after all, was responsible for the comfort and well-being of my sailors, and I looked hard for radiators. We didn't have any on board, not either fitted or loose. There's a funny thing we use in the Navy called a yardarm group. It's a parabolic mirror-shaped reflector, I suppose is the best word, in which we have 10 or 12 electric light globes, and we call it a yardarm group because at night you can hang it from the yardarm and it lights the whole upper deck very efficiently for something you're doing in peacetime on the upper deck at night. I found enough of those in the store to put one in each mess deck and switch it on in the hopes that the light and the heat from 10 electric light globes would take the chill off the air. I don't think it did, but at least it was an attempt to make up for the fact that we had absolutely nothing to deal with the cold. The army ashore, I'm sure, was suffering it far more than we were, but an iron ship with no heating in that sort of climate is a very uncomfortable thing to live in.